Hey Ottawa, this is your Monday market snapshot for the Ottawa real estate market for Monday, April 22nd, 2024. My name is Annalie Rice. I'm a realtor here in Ottawa, Ontario, and every week I bring you the details of what's going on in the Ottawa real estate market. It's also Earth Day, so if you have the chance to get out and either, pick up some trash or do something to reduce your environmental impact on the earth, that's a great day to start making some small changes that will help us and our earth moving forward. Let's get to the real estate update. Okay, so first off, let's look citywide. We see that the number of active listings jumped by over 100 in this past week. So it was pretty steady across different property types with a little bit of a heavier increase on the condominiums. When you look at the number of sales, they were pretty flat from last week, which was actually a bit surprising. I thought it was going to have climbed a little bit more than that. It was only up by 4, and it was mostly in the townhomes, a couple extra condos, and the detached sales were actually down from last week. Okay, so here we have the inventory breakdown in a visual format, and you can see that the overall inventory, that's the black line, we are almost at the same point that we were for overall inventory in the fall at about November, before the listing started to come off late fall. Our active inventory, that's the green, is still about 350 short of our peak last fall, but you can definitely see that if you compare to where we were last April or May, where we were still stuck at about 1,500 listings, here we are up over 2,100. So definitely way more inventory on the market now than there was last year. And the sales are a little, they've been a little higher than what they were last year, but they have started to fall behind what we had at this point last year. So with that, there's just going to be less pressure on prices increasing, which is great for buyers. But also we'll have to see where the inventory continues to go. Inventory tends to keep coming on throughout the rest of April through May, and only starts to slow down kind of in June for the new listings. So we'll see where this goes. Okay, so for new listings this week, we had 511 properties listed this week. 90 of those properties, which represented 18%, were relisted properties, and 421 were, or 82%, were new to the market properties. So you can see that that pretty much matches where our peak new inventory was last year. It's just last year our peak inventory was in May versus in April. So will it continue to climb and have more inventory coming out, even more inventory coming out in May? We don't know. Our sales just up slightly from last week. And then the relists is starting to climb. I guess that makes sense with the number of the amount of inventory on the market and people just wanting it to be seen as fresh listings. Okay, so let's look at the sales and get into the details on this. And I'm actually going to have an extra slide right after this one about breaking down the at or above asking. So stay tuned for that. Overall, this week we had 309 sales. And when we look overall for the whole, all the sales, we had 19% of those sold with no condition, so about 1 in 5. And 31% sold at or above asking. When we look at how quickly places are selling, we had 17% of the sales, which was 53 properties, were ones that had been on the market for 7 days or less. When we look just at those properties, 51% of those sold with no conditions, and 70% of those ones sold at or above asking. So clearly more likely to have no conditions and higher prices if it sells very quickly. Those percentages for the no conditions and above asking are a little different than what we saw last week. I remember last week I mentioned that we had like 87% of the properties were selling at or above asking in those first 7 days. And so this week it's much closer to what we had seen before, down at 70%. And 51% no conditions was actually an increase from the 38% we had before that. When we look at the properties that sold within the first 30 days, so we had 64% of sales, and that was 199 properties, and 19% of those sold with no conditions, which is the average for the whole number of sales for the week, and 44% of those were at or above asking price, which is obviously higher than the overall of 31. But it just makes sense. If a home is selling a little bit quicker within that first 30 days, they have a better chance of selling closer at or above the asking price. So the next slide, we're going to look into the details of the at or above asking. So let's move on to that. Okay, so at or above asking, what does that mean? So of the 95 properties that sold at or above asking this past week, 30 of them, which was 32%, were at asking or $100 over. So that happens when you have something listed at, $599.9 and it sells for $600. So good 32%, a third of those properties at asking. The next little bracket that I did was properties selling less than 1% over asking. And obviously that 1% can differ depending on what the price of the home is. But 12 of those homes, so 13%, were less than 1% over asking, but not at asking. So that ranged between $1,000 over asking up to about $8,000 over asking, depending on the price and depending on how close to the 1% over asking it was. The next bracket was places selling between 1 and 5%, so over 1, but up to 5% over asking, and 37 homes, which was almost 40%, so 39%, sold 1 to 5% above asking. And the range on those ones ranged between about 5,000, obviously if it was out just over 1%, up to 30,000, so 5% over on a more expensive property. Could be up to $30,000. And the last little bracket was anything that was over 5%. And so this week it actually ranged from 5 up to 19% over asking. There were 16 homes, 17%. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of sort of the brackets on that. So something that was just a little over 5%, so 5.25% over on a lower end property, 495,000, equated to 26,000 over asking. Then you've got sort of the opposite, like the highest dollar value over, so 12.5% over on something that was 1.975 million, equated to the $247,000 over. Obviously that's a lot over. And then the highest percentage over, so 19% over on a moderately priced home, so 595,000 home listed, but they offered 112,000 over. So those are just some of the examples of when I'm saying how many are selling at or over the asking price. There's obviously a wide variety. We're looking at about a third of them being like very close to that asking price. The next 30-40% are kind of moderately over, and then just less than 20% are kind of those crazy over. But the reason they're over is sometimes in a lot of these cases is when they're being listed at a unreasonably low price. It is not the asking price. The sellers would never accept that price, and so they're listing it for the sole purpose of trying to get lots of attention, lots of showings, and hopefully lots of offers, which would drive the price more than what they were expecting. Now, I will give an example. So this week I had some clients that were offering on a home that we thought was pretty fairly priced. They were one of 4 offers on the home, and the sellers chose to not accept any of the offers. And then they canceled and relisted. But in this case, they weren't vastly underpriced. I don't think anybody that put the offer on that home thought that they were like pricing well below where they should have been. And so the 4 offers may all have been quite reasonable, but then they relisted and they only went up 50,000. So we'll see where they end up in the end. But and that's an example of what can happen if you list low but not still have perhaps unreasonable expectations of where your home is going to sell. So that's an example. You get places that are listed like a detached home selling at $499. It's not going to sell there. It's going to sell up in the 600,000 perhaps, and that's how you get those big overages, dollar value, and closer to like 15 or 20% over asking price. Okay, so let's zoom into the different areas of the city and see what's going on in the different suburbs. Okay, so obviously the central urban region isn't a suburb, but for the central urban region this last week, we had an increase in property active listings across property types, mostly in the detached and condos. And then the sales were up just slightly for detached and towns, but down for the condos. In Canada and Stittsville, we actually had a drop in active inventory across property types, and it was a pretty slow week for detached and towns, the drop in the number of sales for both of those, but up quite significantly for the condos. In Barrhaven and Riverside South, they had slight increases for detached and condos and a bit of a jump, quite a jump actually, for the number of townhomes listed for sale this week. Sales were up just slightly across property types in Barrhaven and Riverside South. And in Orleans, the active inventory dropped across property types, steady for condos. And then the sales were down fairly significantly for detached, although that might have been a bit of a blip last week for a lot of sales. And towns were up and condos were up slightly as well. Here we have the full data for the different property types. The one thing I did notice is that I think that the number of sales next week is going to be lower than what we saw this week. And the reason I say that is because the number of conditionally sold properties, and if you look on all of these 3 slides, it actually is lower for the number of conditionally sold properties than we have in the number of sold properties. And now we know that maybe 20% of the sales might be without conditions. So those might be brand new properties coming on this week, but the number of conditionally sold properties typically is about the same or a little bit higher than what we have for sold properties. So here we have almost, if you look citywide, there's fewer conditionally sold properties than there are sold this week. And for same thing for townhomes, this one doesn't worry me quite so much. It's a bit of a tighter market. There's perhaps a few more that sell without conditional periods for townhomes, but again, see that the overall for the citywide, the number of conditionally sold properties is below the number of sold. And same thing for condos. And this is, I think the condo sales will be a lot lower because they tend to almost always have conditional periods to review the status certificates. And that conditionally sold is almost always well above what the number of sold in any given week. Okay, so that's the update for today, which is the 22nd of April. I hope you enjoyed the extra information on the sales and at or above asking. Please leave questions or comments if you have any and give it a thumbs up. I hope you have a fantastic week.